I even asked my mom, I was like, it's not my first language. Can I raise my kids in Spanish? And she was like, I don't know, it seems hard. Maybe you shouldn't. And I was like, I belong wherever I am. Wherever I am, I belong because I'm here and that's it. And nobody can say that you don't belong in this space because you're not enough this or you're not enough that. And I would be like, oh, he has like a white voice. Like it sounds like different. Like it's not his normal way of talking. It kind of felt like a little bit of like code switching of like for the caregivers at home, it's going to be really important to protect this multilingual identity and to protect the sense of like bilingualism as a superpower.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Dose, the podcast for immigrants by immigrants. Today, my guest is Dr. Veronica Benavides, the founder of CEO and Bilingual Generation. Dr. Benavides has spent her career exploring and advocating for the intersection of identity, language, and learning. Through her career in education, as a high school and middle school teacher, a Fulbright scholar, a researcher at Harvard, leadership coach, and the executive director of a leading early childhood education research and training center, she's always sought to create strengths-based environments where all people and children can thrive. Today, as the founder of Bilingual Generation, Dr. Benavides works to support the reclamation and flourishing of heritage languages across global contexts. Through learning resources and cohort-based programs for educators and families, Bilingual Generation decolonizes language learning to promote bilingualism in homes and school. And to top it all off, she is the mother to two beautiful children who she is raising as multilingual individuals. Thank you for joining us today. And so in the research of this podcast, I was always just curious about how the Spanish is it's just so different, and I guess in terms of priority in the States, as of course it is in Latin America, because we only have one language over there, right? So learning Spanish is just kind of like a must.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm just super curious to talk about you and to share, the knowledge that you have and how that process in the States of learning Spanish is just so much more complex than we really think about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just read your speaker bio for our intro, and I wanted to ask you if you could take us back regarding how you chose to focus on the intersectionality of language, identity, and culture. Like, why did you choose to dedicate your career to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would love to get more into your experiences too, because I think there are so many intersections and differentiators, but also kind of things that tie us together as Latinos in the US who have a relationship with the Spanish language, but it can look different generationally. And so for me, I have a different experience in the sense that even though Spanish was my parents' first language, I didn't grow up speaking Spanish because they went to school. They were the first in their generation to go to school in South Texas. And they went at a time when they were physically punished for speaking Spanish. There was kind of an English only mandate in the school system. So if they were heard speaking Spanish with their friends in class, then they would get punished for that. And
That's terrible.
it actually really was. And I don't think we kind of really recognize the legacy of that entire generation of, first generation or recently immigrated families and the type of messaging that they received around their language and their identity. We can acknowledge the fact that corporal punishment isn't good in schools, and it often doesn't happen anymore. But on top of that, the messaging that language is not valuable in an academic setting. If you want to advance in life, then that language or that identity isn't going to get you there. And so I think my parents really had that narrative when they had children, and all parents just want the best for their kids. And so they thought the best for us would be to raise us without having an accent. I think what they thought was something that when people heard them speaking in English with an accent, they felt like others saw them as less than or not as intelligent. And so we didn't grow up speaking Spanish, but I was surrounded by Spanish speakers. I was surrounded by, grew up in a very Latino community. And I don't think I ever really saw it as something that I was missing out on explicitly, because it wasn't something that like my teachers were saying, oh, it's a good thing to be bilingual, or, oh, it was quite the opposite. And it wasn't until I got to college that I started to realize how much of that was a missed opportunity, or how much of that was kind of taken away from me through what had happened to my parents, and how I wanted to reclaim that. And so when I was in my early 20s, I moved to Mexico on a Fulbright scholarship in order to learn the language and really kind of get grounded in that. And then went back to the States for graduate school, was in education, and all of my work had always kind of focused on the intersection of language and identity and belonging because of my experiences growing up. And I really wanted kids, no matter what their identity, no matter what their background, to feel that they were valuable and that they belonged in an academic setting. And that's just kind of the work that I've been doing forever because of my experiences. And then when I had my firstborn child, it very much became more focused on language. And the work that we do now at Bilingual Generation, and helping families and helping educators raise children, as we say, who have bilingualism in their bones, who have a connection to their heritage language, to grow up feeling a sense of pride and connection and fluency in that language.
I'm so glad that you brought up the sense of pride, and I actually that's something I wanted to ask you. So having your parents had that experience of like being physically punished for speaking their heritage language, did you grow up with any kind of, or did they maybe have any sense of like shame of their culture, like did they wanted to hide it in any way?
I don't know explicitly. I think I can speak for my experiences because it's like a complex thing. I think there's a big richness and pride in like who we are and where we come from, but then there was also like maybe a reality of like just trying to survive in the world and trying to like make it. And so I think about my dad, and he worked in construction, and he would, work with kind of as a contractor, both ends of like folks who only spoke Spanish, and he was speaking Spanish all the time. And then he would, be on the call with maybe the building owner who had hired them to do this. And I would be like, oh, he has like a white voice. Like it sounds like different. Like it's not his normal way of talking. It kind of felt like a little bit of like code switching of like, even a different way of speaking English, that it feels like, okay, this is what maybe he's learned as a way of like people accepting him or viewing him as more competent or whatever it is. And I
Mm.
remember my mom saying that, like, when she had left the Valley, they grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, that she felt like, oh, that she was like a bit ashamed of her accent in English, and that she felt like people judged her for it and this and that. And so I think that there's this duality to it of like being proud of where you come from and feeling connected to that, and yet feeling discriminated against and wanting to protect yourself and wanting to protect your children. And I think that that's a reality that they navigated.
I think that you put it so beautifully, and I think that a lot of these concepts of like immigration and heritage and belonging are just so much more complex, and we just always try to compress them down. And I can definitely relate to so much that you're saying, because when I moved here, the first thing I wanted to do was blend in, and I wanted to learn English, and I wanted to get rid of my accent immediately, and as I progressed through public school here, I kind of succeeded in certain ways. And then when I got to college and I met like a bunch of international friends, they would tell me like, "Oh, you're so gringa," because I had kind of pushed in the back burner, put in the back burner, so many of these like traditions and my way of being in Colombia, because it was like a survival mode. But when you're young, it's just so hard. Like you just hear that criticism and you're just like, oh, maybe I'm just being like like not fake but inauthentic to who I am, and it's so hard to make sense of all those pieces.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think it's also, as much as we have the experience of like a sense of othering and not belonging in the US as immigrants or children of immigrants, it also has that same feeling when you go back to your home country in the sense of like, ni de aquí, ni de allá, and
Yeah.
I'm not enough of this or I'm not enough of that. And having that dual identity experience and feeling like it's taken me a while to get here. I'm like, in my mid 30s and I'm like, I belong wherever I am. Wherever I am, I belong because I'm here and that's it. And nobody can say that you don't belong in this space because you're not enough this or you're not enough that. And I really want people to feel that sense of belonging because for a lot of my career, I was trying to help children feel a sense of belonging in academic spaces and bringing in their full identity and not feeling like they have to shift it. But some children have experienced a generational loss of their culture and identity and need to reclaim that and need to feel a sense of belonging when they go back to, their culture or where they came from. And like when I moved to Mexico to learn Spanish, I would get made fun of all the time for my accent in Spanish. And it like caused me just to like be quiet and not
Mm.
talk because I was ashamed of it because I look Latina, I look Mexican, like I should be able to speak without an accent. And then I was like, this is my reality. Like, I was born there. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. And it doesn't mean that it's not my language or that I'm not a part of this community or part of this identity because of that.
Yeah. I it's so cool to see like the different experiences, because what you were saying, like you are Latina and you were learning Spanish and you felt like you should have just already know it.
Mhm.
And for me, when I was like learning English, of course I didn't feel like, oh, I should be learning, I should just know the language, but it was just still like I got made fun of, like people would like mimic the way I spoke. People would like highlight my accent every single chance that they get. And I guess what I want to address is how brave you have to be in both instances
Mhm.
to push through that.
Yeah.
And I think that for a lot of Latinos in the States, they kind of almost have the choice not to.
Mhm.
Because, of course, like we're going to retreat to what's comfortable. And if speaking Spanish and getting made fun of, nobody wants to get made fun of.
Mhm.
But in both of our instances, we had to do what we had to do to survive, to communicate, to progress. And I guess my question to you is, how can we instill more of that action to, hey, I know it's gonna be hard, but push through it because it's so worth it to learn your heritage language.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the shift for me came about, again, having this sense of enoughness, like really knowing,
Mm-hmm.
like, wherever you're at and whatever kind of point in your journey is enough. And also to let go of perfectionism. I think I like growing up excelled a lot in academics and in like the school space and in the academic space there is a focus on like right and wrong, like
Mm-hmm.
proficient and not proficient. And I really had to let go of that way of thinking because as far as it had gotten me, it was also very limiting because it limited my ability to try new things or to take risks or to be wrong. And that's really what you need in order to learn a language. And if it's your heritage language, really understanding that the most important thing is connection and not perfection. And I think about that a lot with my grandma. It's my only living grandparent because she was a single mother. And then on my dad's side, his parents died before I was born. And so I had my grandma, and she only spoke Spanish. And I couldn't speak to her for most of my life, like just not
Oh, wow.
because I spoke English and she spoke Spanish. And it was very like limited communication around like tienes hambre or ven aquí or no toques eso, like a lot of like don't do that. That was like it. And then when I became an adult and learned Spanish, it was like this light bulb had turned on because I could talk to her. I could understand her stories. I learned about like, the different men she had in her life. I learned about I never knew she had a child who passed away like when he was an infant. Like I never even knew that I
Oh,
had a
wow.
CEO that existed that, was a part of her life and impacted. Obviously, that deeply impacts you when you have a child that passes away as an infant. And so all of these stories, and she loved to talk. And so, what growing up was just like this passive sound in the background became so meaningful to me. And I think trumped that fear that I had of like, oh, I'm not going to conjugate this verb right, or I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, because at the end of the day, it's really about like connecting and being able to tap into that like intergenerational wisdom.
I absolutely love that, and I couldn't agree more. And I think you just put it so beautifully, and I'm definitely gonna steal that for future conversations. I think that's what I always have wanted to showcase when I encourage people to learn Spanish, because, well, first of all, that's like the first world that I knew, but it's also like, the jokes and the songs, and translation can only do so far.
Right.
And understanding what the exact words mean, even, if you can't fully pronounce them and all of that, is just so powerful. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that. As an educator, of educating children to learn their heritage language, and empowering them in that way, I was wondering, because you're a parent as well, what tools, if you could give like some tools for parents who are beginning to navigate that. Because I mean, one day I want to have children as well, and that's something that I always think about, like, what is the best way to teach them about, like, to be bilingual, because I mean, by nature they're going to have to be bilingual in this United States.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's definitely the direction that the world is going in. So, the when you look at the global population in the US, more than 50% of them are bilingual or multilingual, higher in different countries. And in the US, the adult population is 20%. 20% of them can speak more than one language fluently. So we're definitely lagging behind in that. And what I think is also very interesting in the US is that 20% of adults are multilingual or can speak more than one language, but over 33%, in some estimates, around 40% of children come speaking another language other than English, or are exposed to other languages other than English. So we have this younger population going into our US school systems that have these incredible linguistic gifts, but they're not cultivated in US schools.
Mm.
And that I think is going to change over time. But a part of that is because our school systems were designed to turn us into monolingual English speakers. Like you take my parents, for instance, they came in speaking Spanish, and they could have definitely developed their Spanish in addition to their English. But instead, Spanish became just the language of the home, and English was the language that they learned in schools. As a result of that, they still speak Spanish, but it's not fully developed or fully academic Spanish, or my parents feel much more comfortable reading in English than they do reading in Spanish because it's not something they ever did at home. And then our generation, we also could have learned both of those languages, but ended up going through the school system as a monolingual speakers. And so I guess I start with that because I want to give context to parents, that it's not easy in the US to raise multilingual children because it's generally not set up like that. There are some dual language programs. If you're in an area that has a dual language program, definitely enroll in that. That's going to be a wonderful resource. But a lot of times families don't have access to those programs, or the programs maybe only go up to the third grade. And so I think something that's really important to know about multilingual parenting is that it has to be something that's intentional. You have to have a plan for it. It has to be active. Otherwise, kind of the monolingual environment that you are raising your child in is going to be a very strong one. And even if you have the best of intentions of raising a multilingual kid, that's not going to necessarily turn out that way unless you have some intentional plans behind it. And that can look like deciding like how are you going to raise a multilingual kid? Every family is different, and every family has like a different level of fluency, but there are some different strategies that you can use. One strategy is called like one person, one language. So that can be like, whatever your household looks like. Maybe you are a Spanish dominant speaker, you're going to speak Spanish all of the time, no matter what. And then maybe you're raising your child with your mom, their abuela, and maybe they are speaking another language. So you're kind of each sticking to one language. This is what we do in our household. So I speak Spanish to the kids, and my partner is Danish, so he speaks Danish to the children. And then we're actually raising them in Denmark right now. And this is what I'll say about like is so strong about like English acquisition is that like even though we're in Denmark and Danish is the dominant language and I'm providing the Spanish input, our children are still like really good in English, because my husband and I speak English to each other. At dinner time, we use a method called time and place, where we've decided dinner is in English. So we decide that we're practicing our English at dinner time. And they're 3 and 6, and like, really good. Our 6-year-old is really good at comprehending English and speaking in English and in Spanish and in Danish. But I will say that it takes a lot of intentionality. I can go through the other methods as well, but I don't know how in detail you want to get. But I will say have a plan, prepare for challenges, and know that one of the things that one of my colleagues told me before I had kids was understand that language acquisition doesn't happen just through osmosis. It has to be really active. Yeah, she had 2 children. Her and her husband only spoke Spanish in the home, and her kids understand Spanish, but they just respond to them in English. And she was
Mm.
like, it doesn't happen just because you are speaking the language, but you have to have a plan and some intentionality behind it.
Yeah, that's so cool. That you mentioned that and that your 6-year-old speaks 3 languages, and I'm so fascinated by that because I've been trying to learn Portuguese, and I would say that I I'm I'm proficient. I'm somewhat proficient in it, but I'm shy to speak in it, and I mean, obviously, like I'm not super fluent, so I still just consider myself bilingual, but I get so mixed up. I get English and Spanish mixed up in my head all the time. So there's just like so much confusion going on. And I'm just so curious what happens when you add a third and fourth and fifth language. If you've worked with students, like, are they just so good at switching back and forth? Because I can watch a movie in English and I would be quoting it in Spanish, and I have to think about it. I'm like, did I watch that in English or Spanish? It's just so, yeah, just confusing.
Yeah, yeah, that is pretty cool when you're just comprehending and you're not thinking about the language, which is like an amazing talent of bilingual and multilingual people. I would say what is some of that is like really normal, I would say, especially for young kids, in the early stages to be using their full linguistic repertoire. Like they're communicating by using all of the language that they have, which is totally fine and developmentally appropriate. You as a parent can help them to differentiate between those languages and to, use them and provide some structure around that for them. A part of what we did for our son, like when we were first, implementing this was providing structure around books. I think like from a very early age, he understood the differences between languages and people who spoke them and print materials, because we had our English books, we had our Danish books, and we had our Spanish books in kind of different places. And I remember very early on, he was probably 2, he would grab a book and come bring it to me to read. And I would tell him, no puedo leer ese libro porque está en danés. Tu papá habla danés, yo inglés y español. Si quieres leer conmigo, me traes un libro en español o inglés. And I said, I can't read that. Your dad, is the one that speaks Danish. If you want to read a book with me, it has to be in Spanish or English. And I remember the point of frustration for him where he was just like crying. He was like, just read me this book. And I was like, I can make it up, but I can't read this. This book is in a different language. And I remember that was like a point for him to really understand that, like, okay, this is like a Danish book, and this is a Spanish book, and this is an English book. And these are the people that read these books. And these are the context in which I read that. And that's kind of the beginning of now we're teaching him how to read. And it needs to be like a meta-linguistic awareness of, what are the differences and similarities between these languages? We have these plates that have the alphabet on them, and we talk about the letter A and how it sounds in English is A, and in Spanish is A, and in Danish is A, or it's not, if there are any Danish speakers, I'm sorry for mispronouncing that. But I think from an early age, kids have this incredible capability to manage these different languages, and with some guidance, and this is a lot what dual language classrooms will do, with some guidance, they'll be able to manage those differences and build literacy across all of the languages. Now, if you're like, what is meta-linguistic awareness? That sounds like all of this, sounds confusing. I would say you don't have to worry about all of that. I think if you are maybe choosing to raise your child in one language, in, Spanish, for instance, just focus on that. If they're getting their English at school, like just focus on helping them understand like the sounds of letters, just building as much literacy and vocabulary as possible. And that can be integrated throughout the day, like pointing out a sign that you see and you're like, oh, look at that sign. Can you find the letter B? Like what starts with the letter B? So there are tons of like moments from going from like passively kind of experiencing the world to like turning things into teaching moments for your kids.
I have 2 follow-up questions. I have a friend, for example, that her parents are both Mexican. They moved to the States, and then when they had children, they would just only speak Spanish to them at home. And then when she started like kindergarten in school, she didn't know any English. So it was, I guess it's kind of similar to like an immigrant who moves here, that is just like a little bit of that culture shock. So I'm wondering how beneficial or how preferred it is to just expose the kid to one language first and then like fully expose them to the second one. I'm wondering if that's a technique that you guys would also recommend. And the other question I had was if we could maybe also talk about the possibilities of continuing to learn languages in your 20s, in your 30s, because it is like a common conception that, yeah, children just are sponges and they learn so quickly. But I'm also, right now, I'm reading a book, actually, it's called Hidden Potential, and by Adam Grant, and he talks about all these people who are learning all these languages and becoming polylingual in their 20s, in their 30s, and if we could talk about that as well.
Yeah, for sure. So starting with the idea of speaking to your child in the non-dominant or non-school language. So if it's Spanish or Vietnamese or Hmong or whatever the language is, I think that that's a common practice for a lot of families. And a really good one. Like if that is your dominant language, you should be speaking in a language where you feel like you have like the ability to convey emotions, the ability to like create a very language rich environment. That's great. I think it is so wonderful when kids, come into school speaking a language other than English, because they come in with this rich like linguistic repertoire that's then going to be further developed by being exposed to another language. I think the challenge with a lot of children entering into that experience is maybe the lack of preparation around transitions. It's going to be a huge transition for them. So, one of the things that you can equip them with to help them with the transition is beginning to instill a bilingual identity early on or a multilingual identity early on, saying, like, you speak Spanish, and that is such a gift because it's my love language. It's a language that you can speak to your family to, it's a language that you can use for this reason and that. And you're also going to be learning English this year. And that's so cool because you're going to be bilingual. You can speak to two people. It's going to take you a while to learn these English words. And sometimes you won't know what it means. And sometimes that will feel scary. But don't forget, you know a lot of words. You're really smart. So having these like conversations early on, to help children prepare for some of the challenges that they might face will help them make those transitions. Well, because sometimes they go into these instances and they're like, oh, I don't know anything. Like, I don't know how to say this word. I don't know how to say that word, or I'm confused because I don't understand this. And it starts to impact their sense of belonging, as I mentioned, which is really important, or their academic sense that they're like, oh, I'm not that smart, or I don't know this, which is not true. They're incredibly smart. They know one full language already and they're learning another. And sometimes teachers don't reinforce that. Sometimes teachers are not like, you're so smart and here's another language that you're learning. They might be like, why don't you know this? Yes, or you don't know any English, or you can't control what you're going to get in that environment. And so I think for the caregivers at home, it's going to be really important to protect this multilingual identity and to protect the sense of like bilingualism as a superpower.
Yeah, no, that's definitely such great advice, and something that I think we know subconsciously is like, oh, that's so cool to be bilingual, but a little kid, of course, doesn't have that realization. So super important to reinforce that.
Yeah, and I talk about that a lot with my kids of like the fact that they're multilingual and how cool that is and how great that is because, they're not going to speak all of the languages perfectly to full proficiency at this point. They're still developing in them and they have different, like, so sometimes my son, like when we go to the US, he might be confused about a conversation or he might not fully understand it. And I think him having that like sense of self of like, that's okay, because I also speak all these other languages really well, helps him to approach the situation with some more lightness and some more like playfulness around the languages.
Yeah, that's definitely what we all need. Just a
Yeah.
little bit more of playfulness around that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that kind of transitions well into your other question about like adults. So there is definitely a ton of research around the like neuroplasticity of young children in the ages of 0 to 8. And so there is like all of the things that we say about early childhood as like a sponge are true. And with that, like as adults, we also have the ability to create new neural pathways and to learn new languages. I think the challenge that we have as adults might be more around our mindset around languages of like the fear to make
Hmm.
mistakes or the lack of playfulness around it or all of these things that kids like they're not thinking about when they're developing their language necessarily. Um, is something that I, as a language learner too, because I'm, trying to learn Danish, try to take into their learning experience and know that, for instance, a child who's just starting to speak Danish isn't going to pronounce the word right for the first, 2 years of their life, 3 years of their life. And so it's okay if I'm pronouncing this word incorrectly for a while or that I'm using these structures incorrectly. But what we also can learn from early childhood is that there's a ton of repetition that children go through. in order to learn things, and that repetition are creating these neural pathways. And so as adults, like just having patience and grace with ourselves, and a playfulness too with it. But as an adult language learner, I totally think that we're able to do that. And it's also good sometimes to do that in community. So one of the organizations that I've heard of that I think is doing really wonderful work is called Spanish Sin Pena. Have you heard of them before?
I've
Yeah.
heard of them, yes.
Yeah, and they, I think, definitely hit a sore spot in our Latinx community, that we have a ton of Latinos that like have been disconnected from their language. A lot of what I've mentioned around kind of the history of linguistic oppression in the US, but they want to reconnect, but they feel all this shame. They've been called a no sabo kid. They've been, all of this. And so when you're learning in community or in an identity affirming space, it can help to take away some of that shame or to take away some of that fear that you have.
Definitely. It's funny that you bring that up. My niece, she is learning like English and Spanish, and she will just my mom, she predominantly speaks Spanish, so like she speaks more Spanish to her, which is funny. She recognizes like my mom prefers Spanish, and she will say stuff like no sabes, like to say no sé, she says no sabes, and like we think it's so cute when she's like, oh, no sabes, because she's using it correctly. But if she was older, we
Mhm.
probably just wouldn't be like, oh, that's so cute. We'd be like, no, Isabella, that's wrong.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. I try to embrace the people who are learning it around me, and of course people are always like, oh, I'm gonna say this wrong, this and that, and because I speak fluently, and I, as far as my part goes, I try to say like, hey, like that's okay, like
Mhm.
just try to embrace them, as much as I can,
Yeah.
and not inflict judgment as
Yeah.
much as we can.
Yeah. Yeah.
um
I'll,
so
I'll just add very briefly on that one, because I think if you're around someone that's like trying to learn a language and practicing it with you, a really good practice to do, and something that I do with kids as well, is if you hear them saying no sabes for themselves or no sabo, just model the correct use for them after
mhm.
that. Yo tampoco sé, or yo no sé tampoco, or like whatever the, correct version, so that they're going to catch it themselves. And it's also, for young children, you can do that as well.
Definitely. Yeah. So we've been talking about Bilingual Generation, which is your company. And in the description of it, you talk a lot about the decolonization of language. And I'm curious on what that means. I'll also say that in a lot of conversations online and things like that, I see that people sometimes kind of hide behind the excuse of, oh, Spanish is the language of the colonizer, so therefore it doesn't really matter that we don't learn it, and which I fully disagree with that. And I'm just wondering, so I see like that spectrum of like language colonization being spoken about online. So I'm just wondering what the decolonization of language means, and in the context of your organization and what you guys are doing.
Yeah, what a great question. Thanks for asking that. So it's really important to understand language and how the colonizers used it in different settings. Like it was specifically a tool of colonization to when they came to the Americas. There was this tool of, we are going to prohibit the use of indigenous languages, and everybody must speak Spanish, and we're going to have kind of this homogenous identity. And we also saw that in the US for many years, in terms of like, taking out linguistic diversity in order to have this monolingual identity. We saw it when enslaved Africans were brought over to the US, and the inability for them to speak their language without being punished. I think there's a definite connection between language and power, and between also language and solidarity and identity. We saw this with the Native American boarding schools and, the specific design and architecture around that to divest communities of their language, with the understanding that if we take away their language, we're going to weaken their ties to their community, and we're going to weaken their ties to their identity, and we're going to weaken their ties to their sovereignty. So when we talk about decolonizing language, we talk about understanding that legacy, understanding what it did to us, and understanding some of the colonialistic ways of being that we may have inherited ourselves too as a result of that legacy, and not being judgmental of ourselves for it because we have experienced colonization, our ancestors have experienced it, but being critical and understanding, like, where might we be perpetuating that and where can we interrupt it? And that shows up, at least in me, around like the concept of perfectionism, right? That is a legacy of colonialism. And so me releasing perfectionism is me decolonizing my language. The other thing around colonizing language is around gatekeeping and identity, and saying like, okay, if you only are allowed into this space if you speak the language in this way, or you're only allowed in this identity if you speak the language this way. And so sometimes we do that in the Latino community where we're like, you're not Latino because you don't speak Spanish. That's a legacy of colonialism. That's, a part of that gatekeeping. And so decolonizing language learning for us is really kind of releasing a lot of that shame, releasing some of that perfection, some of that gatekeeping, some of these kind of ways and legacies of colonialism that have impacted or kind of removed us from our identity, our community, our culture. Now, the language itself, Spanish, is a colonizer's language. And I also recognize that. But to me, I would have to go back several generations to get to our ancestors who spoke their indigenous languages. To me, Spanish is my grandmother's language. It's my great grandmother's language. To me,
Yes.
it's a bridge language. It's a language that connects me most closely to to that culture, to that identity. And so while I recognize that it's a colonizer's language, I also recognize it as a bridge language. And the other thing that I really want to impress is that, like, we've also adjusted the language so much to be a blend of time and space and history and culture and who we are. And I think that's a part of decolonizing language too, is allowing the evolution and shift of language as well. That, like, my grandmother's language is not the language that was spoken in Spain. The grandmother's Spanish is not the Spanish that was spoken in Spain. It changed, it differed, it had regionalisms to it. And my mother's Spanglish, right, is not like, the correct Spanish that was used by the colonizers. And so I see that that is also like points of resistance and points of evolving the language to make it our own, and recognizing that as like real and valid is also a part of the work of decolonization.
No, I 100% agree with you. I absolutely love my Spanish language. Like, that's the language of my country, of my family. And what you mentioned, like, yeah, in academia, Spanish is taught like almost like there's like one right way, and of course like conjugations, in order to understand each other. But I always say it, like, from Mexico to Argentina, we all speak Spanish, but it's like all different kinds of Spanish. And I think it's actually really cool to hear all the different variations. Like, in Colombia, we say banano. In
Mm.
other parts, they say banana. I think in Puerto Rico, they say guineo, which makes me think of like somebody riding a horse. I don't know why. So I don't associate that with a banana. And even in Colombia, my mom, she's from the more of the southern part of the country, and there's a lot of like Quechua influence in their Spanish words. And so when I go to her hometown, people are saying all these words that I'm like, what even is this? And it's all the same country. So
Yeah.
it is so awesome to to see all these different variations of the language. And I think that's what makes Latin America such a unique place, because we can put the context together and understand all these variations and communicate with each other.
Right. Yeah, definitely. It is very beautiful, and fun, and sometimes funny to like have the lost in translation. I recently visited Puerto Rico and saw on the menu hueyes, and I was like, hueyes, no quiero comer hueyes, because like in Mexico, huey is like a way, I don't know, like a dude or also an animal.
Oh,
And then in PR, it's crabs. They're crabs.
oh, wow. I didn't even recognize the word. I was like, what is that? So I wanted to ask you, in the process of teaching your kids all these languages, I'm sure there's been a lot of error and trial and seeing what works. If you could go back and tell yourself just like an advice to make it a little bit easier, this whole process, what's the, I'm sure you can have a lot of pearls of wisdom, but what's the one thing you would tell yourself?
Great question. I think I would say don't worry so much and you can do it. I remember at the beginning, I had a lot of doubt and I was worrying a lot. I even asked my mom, I was like, can I, like, it's not my first language. Can I raise my kids in Spanish? And she was like, I don't know, it seems hard. Maybe you shouldn't. And I was like, but I was so dedicated to the idea of them. Like I fought so hard to reclaim my Spanish and I wanted them not to have that same struggle and for it to be easeful for them. So I stuck with it. And I think there was a lot of worry at the beginning. And now I get to see a lot of it pay off. And so I wish I just would have done it with more knowing and less worry.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Absolutely. I was listening to, kind of binging a few of your episodes of your podcast, Talks with Grandma, I think it is.
Talking to grandma. Yeah.
Talking to Grandma. And I absolutely loved it. I just felt so like seen in so many ways. Even if our experiences are different, there's just so much intersection with when it comes to language and the different perspectives. And one that especially stuck to me was the one with, I think her last name was like Santiago Schwartz, and she
Mhm.
was talking about speaking the language of your heart. And in the context that she said it for our listeners was that she's raising her children bilingual as well, and that she encourages them to speak the, especially when it comes about emotions, to speak the language that they feel like they want to speak, not the ones that they should. And I think that I literally think I was breathing a little deeper when she said that, because I definitely have gone through that of like, if I'm home, I have to be speaking like the perfect Spanish and this and that. And there is like so much pressure, especially when you're a native Spanish speaker and you learn English, and then sometimes English becomes just a little bit more I become more eloquent in English, and I'm just like, but I'm Colombian and I was born in Colombia. Like how can this happen? And yeah, there's just so much shame and pressure. So it's definitely something I'm trying to navigate through.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Her episode was so good. And I think really affirming for children, a good example of like how to help children raise them into languages without the pressure, right? Without the sense of like it can be hard to navigate the two languages. Like bilingualism, it's not like a fixed thing. It's your languages kind of can vary and change over time. And so really understanding again the heart language and the point of like connection being the most important thing. It's really, really important.
So the last question that I have for you is regarding polylingual people and children. And what is the, let's talk percentage wise, what is the level of proficiency that you can realistically get to once you add on like 3, 4, 5 languages?
Do not have any research on that. So I can't say like definitively like what the level of proficiency would be when you're at 4, 5, or 6 languages. I think just in terms of experientially and living in Europe, that I think you can have a high proficiency at 4 and 5 languages. Like right now, my son is pretty proficient in 3, and it's not uncommon for children to be raised with the 3 languages and then adding another one. Once you're already multilingual, the multilingual brain is also just more primed and ready for that.
Yeah, that's so cool. I'm just fascinated by that and hoping to join the club
Yes, you
sometime soon. Pero thank you so much for joining us today. This was such a wonderful conversation. Please let us know where we can find out more about you and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated this conversation, and really enjoyed talking about the topics that you brought up. So thank you for having me. Folks can find out more about our work on Instagram at We Are Bilingual Generation. We also have an app, a language learning app coming out for kids, which is really exciting. It's starting out in English, Spanish. And it's identity affirming, developmentally appropriate language learning for young kids. And that is at the Billy app. And you can find that on Instagram as well.
Thank you, Vero, and thank you everybody for joining us today. If you don't follow us yet, make sure to follow us on TikTok and YouTube at 12 Podcast. And this was 12.